Chapter 1. What is this? Matthew muttered as he looked around his surroundings. Everything was pitch black and there were no sounds or anything. Not long ago, he was on his flights bound to America for a business meeting until both engines of the plane exploded midair, causing his plane to plummet towards the ocean, and the moment it struck the water surface, everything turned to what was around him right now. Is this perhaps what they called the afterlife? He was not a religious person. He didn't believe that there was an omnipotent being that created the whole universe. For him, life is as simple as life or death. There is no such thing as a soul that will depart either in heaven or hell. Life simply ceases to exist, yet he found himself somehow awake and conscious, like he is still alive. Is this hell? No, not according to the description of the Bible, but then felt a stimulus. What was it? It was cold, like a droplet of water hitting his face from all over. It was weird, there was nothing around. How is it possible? Suddenly felt what felt like a forceful tug from behind him, and then his eyes began to take in colors. It was blurry, but moments later, he could see that there was dark cumulonimbus clouds drifting in the sky as it poured in torrential water down the earth. Ha! Matthew forced himself to sit up, blinking against the downpour as cold rain washed over him. The gritty feel of mud beneath his hands confirmed what his eyes couldn't quite make sense. Oph was on the ground, drenched in some narrow, shadowy alley. He shivered. Realizing the cold wasn't just from the rain, his body felt different, smaller, weaker, thinner. His hands, once calloused and large from years of work, now looked long and spindly, the skin pale and worn, like that of a malnourished teenager. His breath caught in his throat as he looked down at himself. Was wearing ragged, ill-fitting clothes that were soaked through, clinging to his skin. What is this? He muttered, the sound of his own voice startling him. It was higher, younger. He could hardly believe it. His heart pounded harder as the truth began to dawn on him. This wasn't his body. Matthew scrambled to his feet, his legs trembling under him. The alley was dark, lined with crumbling stone buildings. Rainwater ran down the walls, pooling at his feet in a thick, muddy mess. A faint glow from what looked like lanterns flickered in the distance, giving him a sense of direction. He staggered forward, clutching his arms to his chest for warmth. How is this possible? Reincarnation? No, that's ridiculous. There had to be an explanation, but as his eyes adjusted to the dim light and he took in his surroundings, the impossible began to seem more and more real. He stumbled out of the alley and into a narrow street lined with shabby wooden structures. The few people he saw were huddled under crude awnings, trying to shield themselves from the rain. They were dressed in simple, rough-spun clothes. No cars, no streetlights, no signs of the technology he had once relied on. It was as if he had stepped back in time, way back. What is this place? He whispered to himself as he began to contemplate. There was a shout from the right, coming through. He turned his head to the right and saw a horse-drawn carriage speeding up on the muddy road, and the moment it passed by him, a mud-splattered splashed onto Matthew's legs, further soaking him in the thick, cold muck. He instinctively raised his arms to shield his face. But it was too late. The shock of the moment left him standing frozen for a second, trying to process the primitive scene before him. Horses? Wooden carriages? He wiped the mud from his eyes and took in his surroundings more closely. The narrow street, the stone buildings, and the muddy road all pointed to something far more ancient than anything he had ever experienced, definitely not modern times. He muttered, shaking the excess mud from his ragged clothes. Matthew took a deep breath, pushing through the confusion. There had to be an explanation, and if there was one thing he knew well, it was the value of adapting quickly. His survival depended on gathering information. He needed to figure out where he was, who he had become, and most importantly, how he could leverage his knowledge from his previous life to make sense of this world. Spotting a tavern at the end of the street, with its dim glow and the faint sound of voices carrying through the rain, he decided to head toward it. Perhaps there he could glean some information about this strange place. As he walked, he caught glimpses of the people around him. They looked haggard, their clothes worn and patched, faces gaunt as though life here was hard and unforgiving. The tavern was as crude as everything else, a wooden structure with a swinging sign that was too faded to read. Pushing open the door, Matthew stepped inside. Instantly hit by the warmth of the fire crackling in the corner, the smell of stale ale and cooking meat filled the air. His entrance drew a few curious glances, but most returned to their drinks, uninterested in the soaked, scruffy boy who had just wandered in. The barkeep, a burly man with a scraggly beard, eyed him suspiciously. What'll it be, boy? You got coin? Matthew patted his pockets, half expecting to find nothing, but to his surprise, his hand closed around a few rough, cold coins. He pulled them out, studying the unfamiliar currency briefly before sliding one across the counter. What can I get with this? The barkeep scoffed. The best I can give you is soup. "Soup's fine," he said, sliding the coin across the counter. The barkeep snatched it up and disappeared into the back. Moments later, the barkeep returned, slamming a wooden bowl filled with a murky liquid down in front of him. "Here you go, lad," he grunted. Eyeing Matthew closely, the smell hit him immediately, a rancid odor that made his stomach churn. The soup looked like a thin broth with lumps of unidentifiable meat and some kind of wilted vegetable floating on the surface. It was spoiled. He could tell instantly. The barkeep's eyes were glued to him, watching for any sign of dissatisfaction. If he reacted negatively, it could spell trouble. He wasn't in a position to make enemies right now, especially not in this new world where he was still figuring out the rules. Forcing a smile, Matthew picked up the wooden spoon and dipped it into the foul-smelling concoction. His hand trembled as he brought the spoon to his mouth. The moment the liquid touched his tongue, he had to fight. The instinct to gag, it was worse than it looked, sour, bitter, and with a strong, metallic aftertaste, but he swallowed it down, his throat burning as it went. He said, forcing another smile as he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Good stuff, hits the spot." He nodded, trying to keep his expression neutral as the taste lingered unpleasantly. The barkeep grunted, his suspicion slowly fading. "I figured you'd like it, best soup around these parts." "Can I ask you a question?" Matthew said. "What is it, lad? What year is it now and what country are we in?" Matthew asked. The barkeep scratched his chin, narrowing his eyes as if Matthew had asked a particularly strange question. "Year? It's 1880, lad," he replied, "and you're in Sylvania, you know that. Part of the Grand Republic of Amarathia." 1880? Sylvania? Grand Republic of Amarathia? These weren't names he recognized. Based on this alone, he could tell that it was in a different world. "I see," Matthew said, nodding slowly, trying to mask his confusion. "Thanks for that." Then another question, "Is there any job that I can take based on my body?" The barkeep scanned him from up to bottom and grunted, "Aye, there's work if you're not picky. You're a bit scrawny, but there's always places looking for hands in the mills or the coal mines if you can handle a shovel. We're not far from the mines in the hills outside the city. Hard work, dirty work, but it pays." The barkeep continued, scratching his beard. "Or if you're better with your head than your hands, the railways are always looking for clerks or messengers to help with the paperwork. Sylvania's been laying down new tracks for the last 5 years. So there's work if you can read and write." Matthew perked up at the mention of the railways. That sounded like something he could manage, less backbreaking than the mines and potentially a way to connect with people who had influence. If there were railway companies expanding, that meant money, and money meant opportunity. "Railways, huh?" Matthew said, trying to sound casual. "What else?" "Well," the barkeep replied, leaning back against the counter, "if you're feeling lucky, there's always the taverns and inns. They'll take on young lads to clean, cook, or run errands. It's not glamorous, but you won't be risking your life in the mines, at least." Matthew thought carefully. Manual labor might get him by, but it wouldn't get him far. He needed to position himself where he could gather information and see how this world operated. The railways sounded like the best option. He might find access to trade, goods, and important figures. If this alternate world was anything like his old one, the people who controlled transportation controlled everything. "Railways sound good," Matthew said, nodding. "Where would I go to find work like that?" The barkeep pointed toward the front door. "Head east out of here. Follow the road till you reach the train station. It's a few miles from the center of the city. Just ask for the railmaster when you get there. If they're looking for help, he'll know." Matthew nodded, mentally noting the directions. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He had a destination now, a potential job, and maybe, just maybe, an opportunity to begin building something again. This world might be primitive, but he had the advantage of knowledge and foresight. He just had to play his cards right. "Thanks," Matthew said, pushing the bowl of awful soup aside and standing up. "I'll check it out." The barkeep gave a half-hearted nod and went back to cleaning the mugs, uninterested in Matthew's plans. Chapter 2. The cold, damp air hit Matthew's face as he stepped outside the tavern. The rain now little more than a drizzle. His feet sank slightly into the mud as he started east, following the barkeep's directions. The road was rough, more of a dirt path carved through the center of the town, but it was lined with the occasional lamp flickering in the fading daylight. The surroundings were eerily quiet except for the distant sounds of people going about their business. The road soon gave way to fields, and in the distance, he could see the silhouette of a railway station nestled between hills. Smoke curled lazily from a chimney above the station, signaling some sign of activity. The faint sounds of metal clanking and the occasional whistle of a train reached his ears, filling him with a strange sense of determination. It was a symbol of civilization, and he couldn't help but feel at ease by it as he walked closer to the station. The sight of workers finishing their shift for the day greeted him. They were dirty, covered in soot and grime, some laughing, others trudging silently as they made their way toward the small shacks in the distance likely where they lived. The station itself was larger up close, made of weathered stone and timber, with a few freight cars sitting idle on the tracks. Steam locomotive, huh? Matthew commented. It was like a literal trip to the past for Matthew in his previous life. This kind of technology was part of history books and era long gone, replaced by electric trains and high-speed systems. Now, here he was, standing in a world where this was the pinnacle of progress. Matthew walked up to the main building of the station, its wooden walls creaking slightly with age. The station was simple, functional, and bustling with activity as workers sorted through cargo and organized schedules for incoming and outgoing trains. Not long after, a rough hand shoved him back, catching Matthew off guard. He stumbled slightly, regaining his balance just in time to face the man who had pushed him. The man was broad-shouldered and wore a dark, worn uniform with a tarnished badge on his chest. His face was hardened, with deep-set eyes that glared down at Matthew. "Hey kid, you're not allowed in here," the guard growled, his voice sharp and dismissive. "This is no place for beggars or street rats." Matthew, still catching his breath from the sudden shove, raised his hands defensively. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I was told to ask for the railmaster. I am here for work." The guard snorted, his expression showing clear disbelief. "Work? You? In this state?" He looked Matthew up and down, his eyes lingering on the mud-streaked clothes and thin frame. "You don't look like you could handle a day's labor, much less work on the railway." Matthew fought to keep his composure. He had faced skeptics before in his past life, people who doubted his abilities or his resolve. This was no different. He stood taller, meeting the guard's gaze directly. "I may not look like much, but I can read, write, and handle numbers." "Yeah, pretty much everyone could say that," the guard sneered. "Doesn't mean the railmaster's gonna waste his time on some kid like you. Go on now." Matthew clenched his fists, feeling frustration boil inside him. He couldn't let this opportunity slip away. His life depended on this. If he couldn't get a job, then he won't have money to survive and everything will go to waste. His advantage of having knowledge so ahead of their time. "I'm not leaving," he protested, his voice firmer now. "Just let me speak to the railmaster. He can decide for himself if I'm worth his time." The guard's expression darkened and he took a threatening step forward. "You don't understand, kid. You're not welcome here. Get lost." Before the guard could finish, the sound of a door slamming open interrupted him from the station office. A stern-looking man in his 50s with a gray beard and neatly pressed clothes stepped out, his eyes narrowing at the scene unfolding. "What's all this noise?" the man barked. His sharp eyes flickered between Matthew and the guard, clearly irritated by the commotion. "Can't a man get a moment's peace in his own office?" "This kid was causing trouble, railmaster," the guard replied quickly, standing straighter now that his superior had arrived. "He says he's here for work, but I am here for work," Matthew interrupted. Stepping forward before the guard could finish, the railmaster's gaze shifted to Matthew, appraising him with a skeptical eye, his brow furrowed as he took in Matthew's ragged clothes and thin frame, but something in Matthew's determined expression seemed to give him pause. The railmaster folded his arms. "You're looking for work, are you?" "Yes, sir," Matthew replied, his voice steady despite the tension. "I may not look like much, but I can help. I've got skills that might be useful." The railmaster stroked his beard thoughtfully, then glanced at the guard. "You're too quick to judge, Benson," he muttered before turning back to Matthew. "You say you can read and write. You'd better be telling the truth, or this'll be a short conversation. Follow me." Matthew exhaled a sigh of relief, nodding eagerly. "Yes, sir, thank you." The railmaster turned on his heel and began walking toward the office. The guard, Benson, gave Matthew a sharp look but stayed silent, letting him pass. Matthew followed closely behind the railmaster, feeling a surge of hope inside. Matthew noticed the absence of electrical lighting or modern conveniences. The office was dimly lit by oil lamps where its light flickered across the room. The walls were lined with maps, timetables, and paperwork stacked on a wooden desk. A large window overlooked the platform outside, where the workers moved about preparing for the next incoming train. The railmaster sat behind the desk, gesturing for Matthew to stand in front of him. "So, you claim to be good with reading, writing, and numbers, eh?" His voice was gruff but less harsh now, more curious than dismissive. "That's correct," Matthew simply confirmed. "You look scrawny and there ain't much muscle on you for heavy lifting, but if what you say is true, I might have something for you." He grabbed a piece of parchment from the side of his desk and slid it across the table along with a quill and ink. Let's see how good you really are. Copy the schedule onto that parchment. Matthew took the parchment and studied the contents. It was a simple train schedule with departure times, destinations, and cargo listings, nothing too complex. He worked quickly but with precision, making sure the writing was neat and legible. When he finished, he handed it back to the railmaster, who examined it. The railmaster grunted in approval. Not bad, your handwriting's better than half the men I've got working here. He glanced up at Matthew. You might be useful after all. Matthew's heart lifted. Does that mean I have the job? Maybe. If you pass a series of my tests which will evaluate your overall aptitude for the job. The railmaster leaned back in his chair, narrowing his eyes as he studied Matthew. See, I had an assistant not long ago, and he made a mistake so glaring it nearly derailed half our operations. I fired him on the spot. I need someone sharp, someone who can think quickly and handle the pressure. I'm up for it, sir, he replied firmly, determination clear in his voice. The railmaster smirked, nodding slightly as he rummaged through the papers on his desk. He pulled out a sheet of parchment with a series of questions written across it and handed it to Matthew. Here, he said, tapping the page. Solve this. Matthew took the parchment and scanned the questions. They were designed to test not just basic arithmetic but also logic and practical knowledge of the railway business. The first few questions were simple math problems calculating times and distances, measuring train speeds, and converting cargo weights into load capacity. These were no challenge for someone with his background, however. The questions quickly became more complex. One problem asked about scheduling overlapping train routes to avoid delays, and another tested his ability to reroute cargo during a bottleneck. It was clear that the railmaster wasn't just looking for a clerk, needed someone who could think strategically. Someone who understood the bigger picture of how the railway operated. Matthew took a deep breath and began working through the questions. After a few minutes, Matthew finished and handed the parchment back to the railmaster, who took it without a word. The older man leaned forward, scrutinizing each answer carefully. When he finally looked up, there was a flicker of surprise in his eyes. How come a scrawny man like you do this in such a short amount of time? The railmaster asked. I told you I'm good, Matthew replied. Where did you get your education? Did you have a family background that has a history in the railway business? Matthew shook his head, his expression calm despite the probing question. No, sir, he replied. I don't have a family. I don't know where they are, and everything I know, I learned by myself. The railmaster's eyes narrowed as he studied Matthew's face, searching for any sign of deceit. Alone? Huh? He muttered, almost to himself. That's a tough way to grow up. Matthew nodded. That's all I know. The railmaster leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint sounds of trains and workers outside. The older man seemed to be weighing something in his mind before he finally spoke again. You've got brains, no doubt about that, he admitted. You passed the test with flying colors, and you've got a sharp head on your shoulders. You can work for me as my assistant, but before you can start on your job, wash yourselves first. You look like you've been dragged through the muck. The railmaster smirked slightly, but there was no malice in his tone. I can't have you scaring off everyone looking like that. Matthew glanced down at himself, still caked in mud from his earlier trek. He nodded, grateful for the opportunity but knowing that appearances mattered, especially in a place like this where respect was hard-earned. Understood, sir, he replied. I'll clean up and be ready by tomorrow morning. The railmaster waved his hand dismissively. Good. Go to the back of the station. There's a pump you can use. Benson will show you where you can stay for the night. Be here first thing at dawn. We have a big shipment coming in, and I need someone I can rely on. Thank you, sir. Oh, by the way, I haven't asked about your name. The railmaster raised an eyebrow at Matthew's question, then grunted with a faint smile tugging at his lips. Name's Gerald Stone, but everyone just calls me Railmaster Stone. Been running this station for close to 20 years now. Matthew nodded, grateful for the railmaster's firm but fair demeanor. Thank you, Railmaster Stone. I'll be here at dawn, ready to work. Stone gave a slight nod before gesturing to the door. Off you go, lad. Get yourself cleaned up and rested. Tomorrow's a long day. Chapter 3. So, you actually got a job, huh? Benson muttered, leaning against the wall as he watched Matthew scrub the dirt and grime off at the pump behind the station. His tone was incredulous, but there was also a hint of something else, maybe begrudging respect. Matthew, still scrubbing his arms and face, glanced over at him. Yeah, guess I did. Seems like Rail Master Stone thinks I'm worth a shot. Benson snorted, shaking his head. Well, don't screw it up. Stone's a good man, but he won't tolerate mistakes. One slip up and you're back to being another street rat. I'll keep that in mind, Matthew replied. He knew Benson didn't expect much from him, but that was fine. Matthew had faced bigger challenges than this, if anything. These low expectations were an advantage. It meant no one would see him coming when he started making changes. Once he had cleaned up as much as possible, Matthew stood and stretched. Seeing that he is all washed up, Benson spoke. Now follow me as I will lead you to your quarters. Benson led Matthew away from the pump and through the dimly lit station yard. The station yard was a sprawling, chaotic place. Freight cars stood idle on the tracks, some being loaded with goods, others waiting for the next morning's departure. The smell of coal smoke and oil hung heavy in the air. As they walked, Benson glanced at Matthew. So, what made you come to the railways, anyway? Benson asked gruffly. Seems like there'd be easier work elsewhere. Matthew hesitated for a moment before answering, trying to gauge how much he should reveal. I figured it's a good place to learn how things work, he said, keeping his answer vague. Railways are important, right? They connect everything. Benson grunted, seemingly satisfied with the response. They do, more than most folks realize, but it's hard work. Don't expect to stay clean or comfortable. They approached a row of small, weathered shacks at the far end of the yard, tucked away near the edge of the station's property. Benson stopped in front of one and pushed the door open, revealing a small, modest room. Inside, there was a cot in the corner, a small table with a single chair and an oil lamp. This'll be your place for now, Benson said. It's not much, but it's better than sleeping on the street. Matthew nodded, grateful for any shelter at this point. Thanks. Benson eyed him for a moment, then shrugged. Don't mention it, get some rest. Stone's not kidding when he says tomorrow will be a long day. You'll need to be up before dawn to handle that shipment. With that, Benson turned and left, leaving Matthew alone in the small room. Matthew sat down on the edge of the cot, feeling the exhaustion from the day finally catch up with him. The room reminded him of his place when he was just dreaming of becoming the richest man on the planet, and thinking about that sparked something in him that perhaps he could do the same here in this world. His advantage is that this world is backward. If he were to introduce major inventions that revolutionize the world, he would definitely earn a copious amount of money out of it. But in order to start something that big, he needed money. And he knew being an aide to a trainmaster won't give him much, as he already expected it would be below minimum wage considering his age. Still, it's a progress. Time to rest, Matthew said as he laid down on his bed. The next morning, Matthew awoke before dawn. The station yard still shrouded in darkness. The distant hiss of steam and the clang of metal were the only sounds breaking the silence. He quickly dressed and made his way to the station platform where Rail Master Stone was already waiting. Good, you're early, Stone said. That shipment will be here soon and we'll need to move fast. Matthew nodded, mentally preparing himself for the work ahead. He had no doubt that today's task would be physically demanding, but he saw it as another opportunity to prove himself. What am I going to do, sir? Matthew asked. Rail Master Stone glanced at him, sizing him up once more before answering. You'll be helping the men unload cargo, mostly coal and timber, some machinery parts. It's tough work, but it'll give you a sense of how things operate around here. You'll also help me with inventory, keeping track of the goods, making sure everything matches up. Pay attention, lad. You learn fast enough, and I might let you handle more than just grunt work. Matthew nodded, grateful for the opportunity to learn the ins and outs of the railway business. He knew that starting at the bottom was necessary, but his mind was already working on ways to climb higher, faster. The faint whistle of an approaching train echoed through the still air, and moments later, the dark outline of a steam locomotive appeared, slowly pulling into the station. There, above, he noticed something, a man hopping from one cabin to another, and turning a wheel atop it. Wait, what does that man do? Applying brakes on the train manually, Railmaster Stone replied, noticing Matthew's curiosity. A manual brake system? That was not only inefficient but dangerous. In his old world, automated braking systems had revolutionized railways, drastically improving safety and reducing accidents. This world, however, was far behind in that area. Seems dangerous, Matthew commented, trying to sound casual. It is, Stone admitted with a grunt. But it's what we've got, unless you have a better idea. This could be a major opportunity. An improved braking system would make the train safer and more efficient, but it would take significant investments, and in this era, safety is not the primary concern of any businessman, it was profits. What's more, the idea that he had in mind required significant investments, and the returns won't be much. As for the businessmen, they are just an unnecessary gadget. The train came to a full stop, and the workers moved into action, unloading cargo from the freight cars. Matthew joined in, helping where he could. As the day wore on, Matthew became more familiar with the flow of work. He kept his eyes open, absorbing everything: how the workers communicated, the logistics of loading and unloading, and the overall inefficiencies in the system. It was clear that this world, while functional, was far from reaching its full potential. By the end of the day, Matthew was exhausted. "Here's your salary for the day." Railmaster Stone handed Matthew a money envelope to him. Sir Stone, can I ask you something about the currency? Like, what is the name of the currency, the denomination, what is the minimum, what can I get for this, everything?" Railmaster Stone raised an eyebrow at Matthew's sudden interest in the currency, sensing that something was off. For a boy who had lived in Sylvania his whole life, asking such basic questions seemed out of place. Stone leaned back, crossing his arms, scrutinizing Matthew more closely. "Curious, aren't you? Most folk don't ask questions like that unless they've been living under a rock," Stone remarked. Matthew realized that his questions might come across as odd, but he couldn't take them back now. Thinking quickly, he shrugged casually. "I guess I just never paid much attention to money before, sir. I've always focused on getting by day to day, so I never really learned much about it." Stone didn't seem fully convinced, but he let it slide for now. "Fair enough. Well, the currency here is called florins. You've got smaller denominations called cents. 100 cents makes a florin. Pretty simple system. Really, as for what you can get with it," he said, pointing at the coins Matthew had just been paid, "that's about a day's wages. It'll get you a basic meal and maybe a place to stay for the night." "Thanks, sir," Matthew said, pocketing the coins. "I appreciate the explanation." Stone gave him a sharp look. "You're still asking strange questions, boy, but just make sure you know how to spend what you earn wisely. Work hard, keep your head down, and you'll do just fine." Chapter 4. September 15th, 1880. Matthew reincarnated on the date of September 7th, 1880. And it had been 8 days since that. For the last week, he had experienced the life the people had in the 1880s. It was tough. First, in personal hygiene. There was no consistent running water, making cleaning up a challenge, especially after a long day of work. The communal pump behind the station was the closest thing they had to a bath, and privacy was almost non-existent. He missed the convenience of his old life, where everything was readily available. Every day, Matthew helped unload the cargo and kept track of the goods, gradually earning Railmaster Stone's trust. It was tedious. On the morning of the 9th day, as Matthew was preparing to head to the station, he noticed something different in the air. The town felt busier than usual. As he made his way through the narrow streets, he overheard people murmuring about an important visitor arriving in Sylvania. "What's going on?" Matthew asked as he approached Benson. "Bigwig from the capital is coming in on today's train," Benson grumbled. "The owner of the railway company himself, Mr. Hargrave, is coming to inspect the station. It's causing a stir with all the workers." "The owner? So he is rich, right?" Matthew continued, his interest piqued. Benson shrugged. "Rich? That's an understatement. He practically owns half the railways in Amarathia. When Hargrave shows up, everyone's on edge. He doesn't tolerate mistakes." "So he is that rich, huh?" Matthew mused. "Why are you asking if he is rich?" Railmaster Stone asked with a raised brow. "Please tell me about him." Matthew ignored his question and instead focused on Railmaster Stone. He knew that learning more about Hargrave could give him an advantage in their upcoming meeting. If Hargrave was anything like the businessman Matthew had dealt with in his previous life, there would be a way to get through to him, but only if he understood the man behind the empire. Stone glanced at Matthew, his expression wary. After a brief pause, he crossed his arms and leaned back slightly. "Hargrave isn't just rich, he's a force of nature. Built his fortune from the ground up, started with just a few small rail lines, and now he controls the majority of the railways in Amarathia. His wealth isn't just about money, it's about power. Every decision he makes affects hundreds of thousands of people." Benson nodded in agreement. "He's ruthless when it comes to business. You cross him, you're done. But if you're useful, He'll elevate you faster than you can imagine. Railmaster Stone sighed, his eyes narrowing slightly as if recalling past experiences. Hargrave's got a reputation for being as hard as iron. He doesn't like wasting time, and he has no patience for incompetence. That's why everyone's on edge when he visits. If something's out of place or not running the way it should, heads will roll. He's closed entire stations for less. Has he ever invested in new technology? Matthew asked, trying to keep his tone casual. He has, but only if it increases efficiency or profits. He's not one to throw money on something unless there's a clear return on investment. If you're thinking of pitching some fancy ideas to him, you'd better be sure it's something that'll save him time or make him more money. Otherwise, you'll be out of here faster than you can blink. Interesting, Matthew muttered under his breath. Thanks for the info. Benson chuckled. You planning to impress the man with your ideas, kid? Something like that, Matthew said. Well, good luck with that, Benson muttered, though the skepticism in his voice was clear. He gave Matthew a sidelong glance before turning back to his task of preparing the station for Hargrave's arrival. The day passed slowly, with everyone on edge as they prepared for Hargrave's arrival. The station was scrubbed clean, and the workers moved quickly, their eyes darting around nervously, as though Hargrave himself could appear at any moment by late afternoon. The distant sound of a train whistle echoed across the hills. It was a low, rumbling sound that immediately set the workers in motion. Matthew stood near the platform, watching as the large, sleek locomotive rolled into the station, steam billowing from its chimney. As the train slowed to a stop, a group of finely dressed men emerged from one of the carriages. At the center of group is the dashing of them all at the center of the group. A refined man stood out from the rest. He wore a perfectly tailored three-piece suit with a dark overcoat draped over his shoulders. His top hat sat at a sharp angle, and in his gloved hand, he held a sleek ebony cane with a silver handle shaped like a lion's head. Matthew's eyes locked onto him. This must be Hargrave, he thought, watching the man's poised movements as he stepped down from the train with effortless grace. His steely blue eyes surveyed the station, barely acknowledging the men bustling around him. The station workers, who had been rushing moments before, now stood still, waiting for orders. Railmaster Stone approached, his usual composed demeanor replaced with visible tension. Mr. Hargrave. Stone greeted with a respectful nod. Welcome to Sylvania Station. Everything is ready for your inspection. Hargrave barely inclined his head in acknowledgement. Good. His eyes scanned the station, taking in every detail, as if calculating its value. Let's see if this place is running as efficiently as it should. As Hargrave and his entourage moved further into the station, Matthew stayed back, observing every movement. Hargrave didn't waste time on pleasantries. He questioned Railmaster Stone about logistics, efficiency, and profit margins. His sharp, direct questions put everyone on edge, and Stone answered as best he could. As the group approached the freight cars, Hargrave stopped suddenly. His gaze landed on the workers manually applying brakes to the train. Just as Matthew had noticed earlier, there was a major accident at Columbus a week ago. A train derailed due to faulty brakes, Hargrave said, his tone ice cold. His eyes narrowed at the sight of the men struggling to manually turn the brake wheels. That's unfortunate, Railmaster Stone said. We've been managing fine here, sir, with no major incidents, but our brakemen here are all trained and experienced. We've avoided any major problems so far. Hargrave's lips pressed into a thin line as he scrutinized the scene. Managing is not good enough, Stone. I don't pay for fine. This system is dangerous, which is why I had my engineers come up with a solution, and they are still yet to produce results. Matthew, still lingering on the sidelines, saw his chance. Taking a deep breath, Matthew stepped forward again, speaking before he lost his nerve. Mr. Hargrave, I might have a solution to your braking problem. Hargrave's eyes flicked to Matthew. He didn't expect that the one who interrupted him would be this young. Who are you? I'm Matthew Hesh, an assistant of Mr. Stone. Chapter 5. Matthew, Railmaster Stone uttered again, his voice rising in frustration. He hadn't expected the boy to actually step forward and approach someone like Hargrave. It was supposed to be a joke, a little push to motivate him, not for him to insert himself into a high-stakes situation like this. Get back here? Stone hissed, stepping closer to Matthew, but just as he was about to grab his arm, Hargrave's gloved hand shot up in the air, signaling Stone to stop. Railmaster Stone. Hargrave's voice was sharp, almost slicing through the tension in the air. I didn't ask for your input on how I conduct my inspections, nor who speaks to me. If the boy has something to say, I'd like to hear it uninterrupted. Stone froze mid-step, his expression shifting from irritation to bewilderment. He hadn't expected this reaction from Hargrave. But Mr. Hargrave, he began, only for Hargrave to cut him off with a stern glance. I said let him speak. Hargrave reiterated, his cold eyes turning back to Matthew. Matthew felt the weight of every pair of eyes on him, but he steadied himself. This was his moment. He cleared his throat, standing straighter despite the pounding in his chest. I believe I can solve your braking issue, sir, Matthew began. I noticed the manual braking system you're using. It's dangerous and prone to human error like what happened in Columbus. But there's a way to automate it. Hargrave's gaze sharpened. Automate it? Go on. Boy. Matthew felt the tiniest flicker of confidence. He had Hargrave's attention now. In my studies, I've learned about a concept where you use a central air brake system. It uses compressed air to apply and release the brakes uniformly across the tray, much faster and safer than relying on manual labor. Hargrave's brows raised. Where did you get that knowledge? Did you receive any formal education? I have not, Matthew answered. Then how am I supposed to believe you when you don't have an educational background backing you? I have met a lot of scientists and engineers who spout scientific things that make it sound beautiful, but in application it failed. I understand you won't easily believe me without the credentials, Matthew replied, meeting Hargrave's skeptical gaze, and I understand why, but that's the risk I'm willing to take. I know you don't see what I see, but without taking risks, well, you wouldn't be where you are now, would you, sir? Hargrave's eyes narrowed, his piercing gaze lingering on Matthew as he weighed the boy's words. You speak as if you understand what it takes to build an empire, boy, Hargrave finally said. Maybe not yet. But I understand enough to know that real progress means going beyond what others think is possible. I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I'll show you. If you'll give me the chance, your engineers can test my idea, and if it doesn't work, then I'll walk away. And it's going to cost me money to test your idea. If it fails, the money is lost. How will you pay me for it? I don't think you can ask me to pay for that because this is not a transaction. This is an investment, and an investment could either fail or succeed. I'm offering you something that could redefine your entire operation. How old are you? I'm about 16 years old, Matthew said, though this was just a rough estimate because he didn't know how old his body really is. For someone your age and status, the way you carry and deliver yourself is unexpected. You don't sound like any 16-year-old I've ever met. I've had to adapt quickly, sir. Life doesn't always give you the luxury of waiting until you're older to make something of yourself. Hargrave's lips quirked slightly as though mildly entertained. A clever answer and a bold one. I respect that very well. Since you entertained and made my interest piqued, I will give you a chance. You will come with me back to Amsterdam where our research and development is located. Thank you, Mr. Hargrave. Hargrave turned to Rail Master Stone. See to it that he is ready for departure, he ordered. Then, with a last scrutinizing look at Matthew, he adjusted his coat and walked away, his entourage falling in line behind him. As Hargrave disappeared into the distance, Stone released a breath he'd been holding. You really went and did it, boy, he muttered, shaking his head. I don't know what kind of fire you've got in you, but it's going to need to burn bright if you're following Hargrave to Amsterdam. That man isn't one to suffer fools or dreamers, Matthew. If you can't back up every word you said, he'll cut you loose without a second thought. I understand, Railmaster, I'll make this work. Stone shook his head with a sigh, then nodded toward the station. Well, you'd better start getting ready. If you're going to impress Hargrave, showing up with nothing but the clothes on your back isn't going to cut it. Matthew looked down at his worn clothes, still faintly streaked with grime from the last week. He nodded, realizing he'd need to present himself in a way that matched the company he'd soon be keeping. I don't think I'd be able to afford a suit that would make me look like I belong in Hargrave's world, Matthew admitted, glancing at Stone, but I'll make do. Stone grunted, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Well, boy, you may not realize it, but you've earned yourself some favors here, especially from me. Now, go to the haberdasher just down the street, Stone finished, still smirking. Tell him Rail Master Stone sent you and he'll get you sorted with something decent, nothing fancy, mind, but enough to make you look respectable. Matthew's eyes brightened with gratitude. Thank you, Railmaster. I won't forget this. Don't thank me yet, Stone replied with a gruff chuckle. I'm still not sure if you're lucky or plain foolish going toe-to-toe with Hargrave like that, but if you're going to stand a chance, you'd better look the part. Matthew hurried to the haberdasher, a small shop tucked between the bakers and the blacksmiths. The interior was packed with shelves of fabric, hats, and carefully pressed garments, each with an old-world charm that seemed to match his surroundings perfectly. The haberdasher, a thin man with spectacles perched on the tip of his nose, looked Matthew up and down as he entered. Excuse me, boy. This is not the place where you belong. The haberdasher sneered, his gaze drifting dismissively over Matthew's worn clothes. We serve customers with coin and class, not beggars wandering in from the street. Matthew felt a flush of embarrassment but held his ground. I was sent here by Railmaster Stone, he said firmly, keeping his tone steady despite the clerk's sneering expression. The man's eyebrow arched in surprise, but his expression didn't soften. Stone, you say? He looked Matthew over once more, lips pressed together as if doubting whether such a scruffy boy could really be favored by someone of Stone's standing. Yes, Matthew replied, unwavering. He told me to come here, said you'd help me get fitted. The clerk huffed, adjusting his spectacles with a slight sneer. Do you have some proof that you were really sent here by Mr. Stone? Well, Matthew hesitated, realizing he had nothing that would serve as proof. He hadn't thought he'd need anything more than Stone's word. The clerk's lips curled in a mocking smirk. Just as I thought, he scoffed. Stone wouldn't send some street urchin with empty promises. I suggest you take your leave, boy, before you dirty up my shop any more than you already have. Then I'll be back, Matthew said, his tone steady as he turned on his heel and exited the shop without another word. He knew returning empty-handed wasn't an option, so he marched back toward the station, hoping Railmaster Stone was still there. As luck would have it, Stone was overseeing the departure preparations near the platform. When Matthew approached, Stone looked up with a hint of surprise. Back already? Stone asked, raising an eyebrow. Matthew hesitated only a second before explaining. The clerk wouldn't help me without proof that you sent me, said I looked like a beggar. Stone's face hardened. Did he now? He muttered something under his breath, then nodded firmly. Come with me. They made their way back to the haberdasher's shop, and when they entered, the clerk's expression shifted from disdain to shock at the sight of Railmaster Stone beside Matthew. Stone wasted no time. So, it seems you have a habit of turning away people I've sent, Stone said. This young man is about to accompany Mr. Hargrave himself, and you almost cost him that opportunity because of your judgment. The clerk's face paled. My apologies, Mr. Stone. I didn't realize. I don't care what you realized. Stone cut him off. Just get him something decent and make it quick. Yes, sir. Chapter 6. The clerk huffed, pulling out his tape measure. Stand still, boy, he muttered, tapping his fingers impatiently. Chest, waist, inseam, height? Matthew paused, realizing he didn't actually know his measurements. I'm not entirely sure, he admitted. The clerk rolled his eyes, sighing in exasperation. Figures, another clueless one. He circled Matthew, muttering under his breath. Fine. Let's do this the hard way then. As the clerk wrapped the tape around Matthew's chest, he grumbled. You're about 36 inches here waist, he checked, pulling the tape with a swift tug. 30 inches. Matthew tried to stay still as the clerk worked with quick, practiced movements, noting each measurement with a terse nod. You're about 5'9", he added, looking at Matthew with faint annoyance. Neck, 14.5. Arm length, 33. Finally, he handed Matthew a dark gray suit jacket. Try this on. Matthew slipped into the jacket. Feeling the unfamiliar weight and stiffness of the fabric, it wasn't what he was used to, but it fit decently. The clerk made a few adjustments, muttering as he pinned and marked areas that would need tailoring. Stand straight, the clerk instructed. Adjusting the shoulders, Railmaster Stone, I'll have it ready within the hour. Stone nodded. Good, and see that it's done properly. Matthew and Railmaster Stone waited in silence as the clerk disappeared into the back room with the jacket and his notes on the adjustments. The shop was quiet, with only the faint sounds of the clerk's work echoing from the back. Stone glanced at Matthew occasionally, giving an approving nod as if reassuring him he'd made the right choice in taking the opportunity. After what felt like an eternity, the clerk finally returned, carrying the freshly tailored suit. He handed it to Matthew with a Slight nod. Go on, try it in the fitting room, he muttered, his voice losing a bit of its earlier edge now that the work was done. Matthew took the suit and stepped into the small fitting room, feeling the weight of the fabric as he slid the jacket on. The sleeves fit perfectly, just brushing his wrists, and the shoulders felt snug without being too tight. He buttoned up the waistcoat and slipped into the trousers, noting how each piece now fit him as if it had always been his. He stepped out of the fitting room, standing straighter, a newfound confidence settling over him as he saw Stone's approving smile. Well, boy, you look the part now, Stone said, clapping a hand on Matthew's shoulder. Mr. Hargrave won't know what hit him. How much is this? Matthew asked, glancing at the clerk. The clerk looked him over, a hint of newfound respect in his gaze. 4 florins for the suit, tailorings included since you're a friend of Mr. Stone's. Matthew glanced at Stone. You are going to pay for this, right? Don't worry about it. As I mentioned earlier, you won't owe me a thing, Stone replied with a reassuring nod, settling the payment with the clerk before they stepped out onto the street. He tugged at the cuffs and adjusted the collar. Still getting used to the fit as they walked, Stone glanced at him with a smirk. Getting used to it? He asked. Feels strange, Matthew admitted, but good, I think. Stone chuckled. That's how it starts. Soon enough, you'll wear it like you were born to. Now, remember, Hargrave isn't the sort to wait on anyone. Be ready to speak when he arrives. They arrived back at the station and took up a quiet spot by the platform. Matthew straightened his posture, his eyes fixed on the tracks, willing himself to focus. Stone stood beside him, hands clasped behind his back. A silent show of support as they awaited Hargrave's return, and they found him walking along his entourage as if giving them the final words, and then, with a sharp glance, Hargrave spotted Matthew in his tailored suit. He paused mid-sentence, his gaze narrowing as he appraised the young man before him. There was a faint, almost imperceptible nod of approval before he resumed his conversation with the men around him, sending them off with brisk handshakes and curt orders. Finally, he approached Matthew, his eyes flickering over the suit, then locking onto Matthew's face. Well, I'll say this, you certainly clean up well, Hargrave remarked, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Appearances may not be everything, but they do matter. You're going to find that out quickly enough. Thank you, Mr. Hargrave, Matthew replied, holding his ground under the man's scrutinizing stare. Hargrave nodded, seemingly satisfied, and motioned for Matthew and Stone to follow as he strode toward his private carriage cabin on the train. Matthew followed Hargrave and Stone into the cabin, his eyes widening slightly as he took in the opulent interior. Dark wood paneling, fine leather seats, and brass accents filled the space. Hargrave settled into one of the plush seats, motioning for Matthew to sit opposite him. As soon as they were seated, Hargrave wasted no time, pulling out a portfolio from his briefcase and laying it on the table between them. These are our existing brake system schematics, he said, his gaze never leaving Matthew. Explain to me how it works. For what purpose? Matthew asked, looking for an explanation. Well, you are going to introduce something new, right? In order to do that, you must understand the problem of the current technology in order for you to make a new iteration or a completely new one. Matthew nodded, gathering his thoughts as he scanned over the schematics in front of him. The current brake system, sir, is what's known as a manual or handbrake system, he began, glancing at Hargrave to ensure he was on the right track. Each car has its own braking mechanism that a brakeman has to operate individually. This system relies entirely on the physical effort and coordination of the crew, which means there's a high margin for error. Hargrave's expression remained inscrutable, but he gestured for Matthew to continue. The issue lies in its unpredictability and inefficiency, Matthew went on. During an emergency, if just one brakeman is out of sync or fails to respond quickly enough, it can lead to a disastrous delay in stopping the train. It's also incredibly strenuous for the crew, especially on longer trains, and, as we saw with the accident in Columbus, the manual system can't always be relied on in critical moments. He paused, watching as Hargrave's eyes narrowed slightly, contemplating his words. That's where an automated air brake system would make a difference, Matthew said, leaning forward slightly. By having a centralized mechanism using compressed air, the brakes would engage simultaneously on each car, eliminating human delay and the risks associated with manual operation. Hargrave leaned back, fingers steepled as he studied Matthew. You've certainly identified the flaws accurately, he remarked. But theory alone won't suffice. The concept may be sound, but the transition from idea to application is a challenge most young innovators underestimate. Matthew met his gaze, a spark of determination in his eyes. I'm aware, Sir, I'm prepared to prove it. Hargrave's lips twitched in what might have been the hint of a smile. We'll see, but consider this your first test. I want you to refine this proposal. No problem. Chapter 7. He allowed himself to settle into the carriage, noticing immediately the stark differences in the train's performance and comfort. The wooden seats, despite their leather upholstery, had a rigidity that conveyed every minor tremor and shift of the train as it rolled over the tracks. Each bump jolted through the car, a reminder of the limitations in suspension design that Matthew couldn't help but mentally dissect. He noted the stiffness in the springs, likely a leaf spring configuration, which was standard for the time but far from refined. The lack of shock absorption was apparent, leaving every vibration from the tracks to travel through the seats and into the carriage's walls. It was effective enough to keep the train in motion, but inefficient for passenger comfort and stability. The rumbling, too, was more pronounced than he'd anticipated. The metal wheels ground against the rails, creating a clattering sound that reverberated through the compartment, accompanied by the consistent, rhythmic pulse of the pistons. Steam-powered locomotives, he knew, had an elegance in their simplicity. Yet the intensity of the engine's thumping reminded him of the energy inefficiency it held. The train's fuel consumption had to be immense, he realized, as he watched thick plumes of steam shoot out from the engine's stack at regular intervals. A sure sign of how hard the engine was working. As they continued, Matthew shifted slightly, feeling the slight sway of the car at higher speeds. The lack of precision in the connection between cars made every curve a challenge, with the couplings allowing too much lateral movement. This created a constant, low-grade wobble, an oversight that could be easily addressed with a more centralized stabilizing mechanism. Hargrave seemed to notice Matthew's eyes wandering around. "What's the matter?" he asked, his tone half curious, half amused. Matthew snapped his gaze back to Hargrave, catching himself before any hint of his thoughts slipped through. "Nothing, sir. It's just that this is my first time riding a train, that's all." "Really? But you work for Railmaster Stone. I'm sure you have boarded a train before to know its operation." "Well, my work was pretty much around managing things in the station or the office, not actually traveling on trains," Matthew reminded. "The way your eyes wander around, it seems that you are observing. What are you observing?" "Well, as much as I admit that the invention of steam locomotives allowed us to travel long distances, I am thinking that it can be improved in terms of comfortability for passengers." Hargrave raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharpening. "The best, you say? Enlighten me. Then, what exactly do you think could be improved?" Matthew took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "Well, for one, the suspension could be adjusted to soften the ride. The leaf springs are durable but rigid. Each tremor and jolt from the tracks transfers directly through the seat, making longer journeys rather uncomfortable." Hargrave listened, his expression unreadable. Encouraged, Matthew continued. "Additionally, the noise is significant. The clattering of the wheels on the rails and the intensity of the pistons thumping can wear on passengers. Dampening that sound could make for a far more pleasant experience." "Noise dampening?" Hargrave repeated, a trace of amusement in his tone. "This is a steam locomotive, Hesh, not a luxury parlor." "Understood, sir," Matthew replied, unfazed. "But I believe there's an opportunity here, especially for passenger trains. Improving the suspension and sound insulation would not only increase comfort but also open new avenues for longer, more profitable routes, and the connections between the cars," he added, "are somewhat loose. If stabilized, there would be less sway on curves, adding to the safety." Hargrave's lips quirked in a half-smile. "You have an eye for mechanics, and here I thought you were just a boy with ideas about brakes. Just who are you really?" "I told you my name, sir. That's who I am." Hargrave chuckled. "Ever heard of the Amorathian dream?" "What is it?" "The Amorathian dream," he began, his gaze drifting out the window for a moment. "It's the idea that, through hard work, innovation, and perhaps a bit of grit, anyone can rise above their circumstances. The freedom to pursue one's ambitions, to make a name for oneself even if one starts with nothing." Matthew listened intently, intrigued by the concept, which seemed to mirror what he'd always heard about his own world's ideals of opportunity and success. "It's what drives men to build railways through mountains, to raise cities out of barren land, to construct machines that defy nature itself, the dream of something better, of success on one's own terms, is a powerful motivator, Hesh. Hargrave continued, his eyes settling back on Matthew. And those who pursue it often find they have little room for error. It requires vision and an unrelenting dedication to improve. The Amarathian dream has no sympathy for those who fall behind, Hargrave added. Only those with the courage to push forward, to innovate, and to adapt find their way to the top. So, you believe there's no limit to how far someone can go? I don't only believe it, I proved it, Hargrave said. And you might have a chance of achieving that dream with your knowledge. Matthew smiled. I think I can. 12 hours later, Matthew caught sight of the sprawling Grand Station of Amsterdam. The platform was bustling with people, each in a rush to catch their next train or to welcome travelers arriving from across the Republic. As they disembarked, Matthew was momentarily taken aback by the sheer number of people weaving through the station. It was a scene far more vibrant and crowded than anything he'd experienced in Sylvania, where the pace was far slower. Stone buildings stretched upward on either side of the streets, with shops and businesses occupying nearly every corner. Stepping outside the station, however, Matthew was hit by an entirely different aspect of city life. The unmistakable stench of horse manure struck him almost instantly, and he struggled to keep his composure. Flies buzzed incessantly over piles left behind by passing carriages, and the streets were muddy and uneven from countless hooves and wheels churning up the road. He swallowed hard, forcing back a surge of nausea as he sidestepped a particularly large pile on the edge of the walkway. Hargrave, noticing Matthew's reaction, chuckled, Welcome to the heart of progress, Hesh. You call this the heart of progress? Matthew gagged. Even the finest cities can't quite escape there. Earthy realities, Hargrave said. I think I'm going to puke, Matthew stammered, clutching his stomach as he tried to breathe through his mouth. The odor was unrelenting, filling his lungs with each inhale. And his eyes watered as he struggled to maintain his composure. Hargrave chuckled, seemingly unfazed. You'll get used to it soon enough. This is the reality of city life. People come here with dreams, and they bring with them the mess of progress. Matthew nodded, though he couldn't entirely hide his discomfort. Chapter 8. Hargrave stood, motioning for Matthew to follow him through the building's grand hallway. They exited through a side door, stepping out onto a cobbled street where a sleek black carriage awaited them. Two powerful horses stood harnessed, their coats glossy in the late afternoon light. Hargrave climbed in without a word, and Matthew followed suit, settling into the plush interior. Once they were seated, Hargrave leaned forward, tapping the side of the carriage to signal the driver. With a sharp crack of the reins, the horses set off, their hooves clopping rhythmically against the cobblestones as they navigated the bustling streets of Amsterdam. Matthew peered out the window, watching as the city passed by in a blur of faces, signs, and stone facades. What do you think of Amsterdam so far? Hargrave asked, his eyes fixed on Matthew with an intensity that seemed to demand more than a polite answer. I don't know what to say. This is the civilized city in this country, and yet it's so, the smell, it's unbearable. Hargrave chuckled, clearly amused by Matthew's bluntness. Ah, the charm of the city, he said with a wry smile. That smell, as you put it, is unavoidable when you gather this many people in one place. The price of progress, Hesh, things aren't always pleasant. But that's the trade-off we make. I take it Sylvania is a bit quieter? Hargrave asked, studying Matthew. Much quieter, Matthew admitted. Not as many people or horses. Hargrave laughed. Well, you're in the center of the Republic's business world now, where wealth is earned, deals are made, and inventions, those that succeed, anyway, can change entire industries. Tell me, what do you think is the solution for all of this, Poop? Hargrave asked. Well, I think we have to eradicate horses and seek another mode of transportation, Matthew answered easily. That is the obvious solution, but if you remove the horses, you will remove a significant piece of the city's current infrastructure. Hargrave finished, raising an eyebrow at Matthew's quick response. Horses may seem inefficient, but they're foundational. Removing them entirely would cause an upheaval, one that the city might not be prepared for. Matthew nodded, realizing the truth in Hargrave's words. I suppose so. They're vital for goods, transportation, even for status. Which is why we are building a network of locomotive trams in the city in hopes of reducing the number of horses. But they are expensive, right? Matthew finished. Hargrave nodded, a hint of frustration flickering across his face. Precisely, the technology is costly and not everyone is convinced it's worth the investment. Most people are used to their horses, despite the filth and inefficiency. Change, especially one that affects daily life so fundamentally, often meets with resistance. Matthew looked thoughtful, but if it's made affordable and efficient enough, people will adapt. Once they see the benefits, the inconvenience of switching will seem minor. True, Hargrave replied, watching him closely, but even with efficient machinery, there are challenges. Tracks must be laid throughout the city, investments secured, and the whole system maintained. It's a logistical nightmare and an economic gamble. Are there enough people willing to back the project? Matthew asked, curiosity piqued. Some, Hargrave said with a sigh, but the majority are waiting to see results before they invest. Investors often need proof, something tangible to demonstrate that the costs will be justified. That's why, for now, we're focusing on select routes. Well, even if we succeeded, trams alone can't solve the issue of the city's growth and movement of goods, Matthew said, leaning forward slightly. I'd imagine a more versatile system, perhaps one that's not bound to tracks. Something that could maneuver freely around obstacles and wouldn't be limited to a fixed path. I can't imagine what you have in mind. Oh, we are here, Hargrave said, cutting off his own words as the carriage slowed to a stop in front of an imposing building. Engraved in large, bold letters above the entrance were the words Hargrave Railway Company. Research and Development. The carriage halted, and Matthew took a careful step down, immediately scanning the cobbled street for any unwelcome hazards. He sidestepped a rather unpleasant pile of manure on the curb, wrinkling his nose as he made his way toward the building's entrance. Hargrave, noticing Matthew's careful navigation, smirked slightly. A wise choice. The streets here may be lively, but they demand a certain awareness from those who walk them. Matthew nodded, forcing himself to breathe shallowly. That's putting it mildly. Hargrave chuckled and led the way through the main doors of the building, where the air felt significantly cleaner. The entry hall was wide and orderly, filled with the quiet, efficient energy of a workplace that took itself seriously. Engineers and clerks bustled about, exchanging brief nods and glances as they recognized Hargrave. They passed through a series of corridors until Hargrave stopped at a pair of heavy double doors. This, Hesh, is where you'll be putting your theories to the test. He opened the doors, revealing an expansive workshop and laboratory space filled with worktables, tools, and various machines humming away as engineers tinkered with parts. Matthew's eyes roamed over the equipment, mentally noting the various pieces he might need for his work on the brake system. He could see prototypes of different mechanisms, drafts and schematics strewn across tables, and a few half-assembled devices resembling early models of braking systems. Hargrave gestured toward a workstation near the back, where blueprints of the current brake models were laid out alongside tools and measuring instruments. This is your station. Consider it your command post. You'll find all the tools and parts you need here. I expect you to turn your ideas into something tangible, and I'll introduce you to the head of our engineering team shortly. Hargrave finished, his gaze lingering on Matthew as if evaluating his readiness. Matthew took a deep breath. Nodding in acknowledgement, he approached the workstation, running his hands along the blueprints and examining the tools laid out before him. Everything he could possibly need was here, from precision instruments to heavy-duty equipment, each neatly arranged and well-maintained. The scale of the resources reminded him that Hargrave was not merely entertaining his ideas, he was giving Matthew a real chance to prove himself. As Matthew was inspecting a drafting compass, a tall, lean man with wire-rimmed glasses and an oil-streaked apron approached. He had an air of quiet authority about him, with a gaze as sharp as any tool in the workshop. Mr. Hesh, I presume, the man asked as he scanned him with his analytical eyes. You are young, I'm sure Mr. Hargrave had made a mistake of placing you here, he continued, his tone sharp with skepticism. Matthew met his gaze, unfazed. I understand, Mr. Edward Tanner, the man replied, giving a curt nod, head engineer here in the RD division. Oh, so you will be the one I'll be working with, Matthew said. Tanner's lips pressed into a thin line, his brow furrowing slightly. Let's get one thing straight, Hesh, he said, his tone laced with irritation. I am not here to hold your hand through some wild ideas. Mr. Hargrave may have faith in your potential, but as far as I'm concerned, this is a distraction from real work. I'm here to contribute, not to waste your time. If I can't prove myself, then feel free to ignore me. Tanner scoffed, crossing his arms. Easier said than done. This station, this equipment, it's all resources that could go to people who know what they're doing, people who have earned their place here. He looked Matthew up and down, his skepticism deepening. You, however, have yet to prove you belong. Then I'll work on that, Matthew replied simply, refusing to rise to Tanner's bait. Tanner let out a huff, clearly annoyed by Matthew's calm demeanor. Fine, he snapped, gesturing to the array of tools and parts. You have all the resources you need. Let's see if you can turn that sketch into something usable. Or, at the very least, into something that doesn't break within 5 minutes of testing. Without waiting for a response, Tanner turned sharply on his heel, muttering something under his breath as he stalked away to check on another project across the room. Matthew took a deep breath, his eyes lingering on Tanner's retreating figure. This is going to be difficult. Chapter 9. Matthew already had everything he needed to begin drafting the air brake mechanism. He took a deep breath, surveying the blank drafting paper before him. It would be labor-intensive, far more so than he was accustomed to, without the luxury of computers to expedite the process. Every line, every calculation had to be drawn and checked manually. He picked up a pencil, pressing the tip to the paper as he began to sketch out the preliminary structure of the system. Starting with the central compressor, he carefully mapped out the components, from the piston chamber to the reservoirs. He paused occasionally, double-checking his measurements with the slide rule to ensure every calculation matched hours past, the work demanding more focus and patience than he had anticipated. The room around him faded as he became engrossed in his task. His mind locked onto the challenge. Each stroke was meticulous, and each adjustment to the schematics had a purpose. He designed an interconnected network that would allow for rapid air distribution to every brake cylinder along the train, intending for them to engage simultaneously, eliminating the dangerous delays caused by manual brakes. Midway through his work, he sensed someone looming over his shoulder. He looked up to find Tanner standing there, arms crossed, peering at the sketches with a frown. "So, this is your big idea?" Tanner asked, his tone carrying an edge of doubt. "Mr. Tanner!" Matthew exclaimed lightly as he faced him. Tanner leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized Matthew's schematics. So this is the brake system mechanism that you have in mind, huh? It's designed to be both practical and efficient. Sir, the air distribution system will ensure uniform braking, reducing the reliance on human timing." Tanner straightened, crossing his arms with a skeptical look. "And you really think this compressor and piping arrangement will hold up under the pressure? You're working with theoretical values here, but real-world application isn't so forgiving. That's why we'll test it, Mr. Tanner. I'm more than willing to refine the design based on the results." Tanner's lip quirked into a half-smirk, his expression suggesting he was still unconvinced. "We'll see if it even gets that far. Mr. Hargrave may have taken an interest in your talents, but I've seen plenty of young minds think they can outdo years of industry experience with a few fancy ideas. Reality has a way of humbling the eager. Which is why I'm going to turn this into reality. Mr. Hargrave has ordered you to help me. So follow that order if you don't want to get yourself on Mr. Hargrave's bad side." Tanner's expression darkened, his brows drawing together in annoyance. "Watch it, boy. Respect is earned, not demanded," he snapped, though his voice was low enough not to draw attention from others in the room. "I've been here long enough to know that most ideas are just that, ideas. They often don't hold up when put to the test." Matthew met Tanner's glare steadily, refusing to be intimidated. "That's why we have this workshop. We'll see what holds up, and I'm here to do exactly that: test, refine, and adapt." Tanner huffed, clearly unimpressed but resigned. "Fine," he muttered, glancing back at the blueprints. "If you're so sure this will work, I suppose we'll find out soon enough, but don't expect me to make things easy for you. Hargrave may have his eye on you, but that doesn't mean you've proven anything to me." "I understand, Mr. Tanner," Matthew replied evenly. "I'm here to do the work, not to win popularity contests." Tanner gave a curt nod as though accepting this grudging truce. "Good. Then get back to it. I'll see to it that you have the materials you need." September 22, 1880. Matthew had the chance to gain an audience with the people working on the workshop, with Tanner leading them. Matthew cleared his throat, standing in front of the workshop team as they gathered around the large drafting table where he'd laid out his schematics. Tanner, visibly uninterested but dutifully present, leaned against the table, arms crossed, waiting for Matthew to begin. "Thank you all for taking the time to be here today. I'm here to introduce an air brake system designed to improve safety and efficiency across our rail network. The goal is to create a system that applies brakes uniformly to every car on the train, reducing human error and, ultimately, the risk of accidents." He gestured to the first diagram, showing the compressor. At the heart of the system is this central air compressor, which will generate the compressed air needed to operate the brakes. This compressor will be placed at the front of the train and connected to an air reservoir tank, ensuring a constant supply of pressurized air. One of the engineers raised a hand. How does this differ from the standard brake mechanism we're using now? Good question. Matthew nodded. In the current manual system, each brakeman applies the brakes individually. This takes time, and any delay or inconsistency can create dangerous gaps in braking efficiency along the train. With this design, when the engineer activates the brakes, air pressure is simultaneously released through these interconnected pipes. He pointed to the schematic and distributed evenly to all the cars. This ensures a near instantaneous response across the train. Tanner raised an eyebrow. And what's your solution for maintaining the air pressure throughout an entire train? You're expecting an untested compressor and pipes to hold up under significant strain. I've accounted for that, Matthew replied confidently. Each brake cylinder along the cars will have a check valve, ensuring that the pressure remains consistent even if there's a minor leak in one of the pipes. Additionally, the compressor and the reservoir are designed with redundancy in mind theory capable of building up and storing additional air pressure. So even under strain, the system won't fail. A few of the engineers nodded thoughtfully. Their interest peaked, but Tanner's skepticism remained. So you say, Tanner replied, but let's not ignore the wear and tear on the pipes and cylinders over time. With the level of pressure you're suggesting, the system could degrade quickly. Which is why I'm proposing that we use reinforced materials for the pipes and conduct regular inspections. Matthew replied, holding Tanner's gaze. It's a long-term investment, but one that would pay off in safety and reliability. He took a breath, sensing he'd managed to capture at least some attention in the room. I'm aware that any new system comes with its risks, and that's why I'm committed to thorough testing and refinement. But I believe that if we can get this right, we'll not only make our trains safer but also set a new standard in the industry. Tanner gave a slight, reluctant nod. It's a bold idea, he said, his tone begrudgingly neutral. And if you're as committed to testing and refining as you claim, then maybe there's something to it. Matthew nodded in acknowledgement. I am, and with all of you here, I know we can make it happen. What materials are we going to use? One of the engineers asked. He pointed to a section of the blueprint where he had detailed material specifications. For the main pipes, I'm recommending wrought iron, he began. It has the strength to withstand the pressure and is durable enough to handle the wear over time. It's also more resistant to rust, which is essential given that condensation could build up inside the pipes. One of the engineers nodded, seemingly satisfied. And for the brake cylinders? For the brake cylinders, we'll need cast iron with a specific interior coating, something that reduces friction and increases longevity. Ideally, this should be a tin-based coating, as it's durable and less likely to corrode under constant exposure to air and moisture. Matthew moved on to the compressor. For the central compressor, high-strength steel would be the ideal choice. It's capable of withstanding the immense pressure we're dealing with, and it can be forged to precise tolerances to ensure efficiency. Tanner looked skeptical, his arms still crossed. And you think this reinforced structure will hold up to frequent use? That's precisely why I specified these materials, Matthew replied confidently. Each piece was chosen to withstand repeated cycles. With proper maintenance, the system will remain operational for years. And for the connectors, I'd suggest brass. It's not only durable but also provides a better seal against air leaks. Tanner raised an eyebrow, still assessing. Brass isn't cheap. No, it's not, Matthew agreed. But it's an investment in the reliability and safety of the entire system. If we cut corners here, we'll risk leaks, which defeats the purpose of the system entirely. Another engineer chimed in. And the reservoir tank? What materials are you considering for that? Thick cast steel, Matthew answered without hesitation. The tank needs to handle maximum pressure and act as a backup supply. Steel can hold pressure better and won't fatigue as quickly, plus it can be manufactured in large quantities at a more controlled cost. Tanner glanced at the team, finally looking impressed despite himself. You've certainly done your research. I did, after all. There are high expectations for me. The engineers exchanged glances, some of them nodding, others considering the materials. Tanner, though still reserved, seemed to be warming slightly to the feasibility of the project. Well then, Tanner said at last. Let's get to it. I'll order the necessary materials and we'll see if your theories hold up. Chapter 10. It's going to take 3 weeks for the materials to be delivered to the research and development facility of Mr. Hargrave, and Matthew had no choice but to wait on it. Without materials, they can't start the job. So he decided to walk outside and explore the city of Amsterdam. Outside, just as he expected, the smell of horse manure piled along the busy streets hit him instantly, nearly as strong as it had the first time he stepped out of the carriage. He wrinkled his nose, trying to ignore the stench, but as he moved forward, the overwhelming energy of Amsterdam began to draw his attention elsewhere. People bustled past him in waves, each seemingly occupied with their own purpose, merchants yelling out their prices, street vendors waving fresh produce, and gentlemen tipping their hats to finely dressed ladies. Amsterdam was alive. A city in constant motion, with carts clattering over the cobbled roads, horses whinnying as they pulled heavy loads, and children darting through the crowds. In fits of laughter despite the chaos, Matthew found himself intrigued by the ingenuity around him. The shop windows displayed everything from intricately crafted watches to bolts of fine fabric, and even early versions of household devices he'd only seen sketches of back in Sylvania. As he wandered further, he noticed the streetcars clinking along the tracks. Some were still horse-drawn, while others were the newer locomotive trams he had heard Hargrave mention. That tram had a name on it. It was from Hargrave, so Hargrave dominated the railway industry in the country. With that, he realized something. If he were to make his own company, it must be something novel and new. Competing against an established giant would only bring one business to ruin, as it won't be able to withstand the pressure of competition, especially without significant resources or influence. Looking around, he already knew what the country needs to eradicate horse poops on the street. It was to introduce automobiles. The proliferation of the automobile would revolutionize Amsterdam's streets, freeing them from the muck and chaos of horse-drawn carriages. Automobiles could transform urban transportation, offering faster, cleaner travel without relying on animals that filled the streets with waste and congestion, which is often a health risk. As he turned the corner, a man caught his eye, standing atop a wooden crate and calling out to the crowd while waving small, colorful flyers in the air. Come one, come all. Witness the future of Amsterdam. A grand lighting ceremony in front of the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. Curious, Matthew approached him, accepting one of the flyers. The paper was printed with bold letters announcing the Grand Amsterdam Lighting Ceremony, promising a spectacle involving the latest in electric lighting technology, a revolutionary development in the city's efforts to embrace modern advancements. So this world already figured out a way to harness electricity and put them into streetlights, Matthew murmured, examining the flyer more closely, and it appears that it was invented by a man named Alexander Volta. Interesting. I'm going to attend. As evening settled over Amsterdam, Matthew found himself amid a growing crowd in front of the stock exchange. It was 7 o'clock, and the only illumination came from the dim oil lamps lining the street. Everyone was waiting for the moment they'd read about, the grand unveiling of electric lighting. Matthew stood near the front, watching as men in smart suits and women in elegant dresses gathered, whispering among themselves about Alexander Volta's revolutionary technology. A man in a top hat and coat stepped onto a makeshift platform near the stock exchange's entrance, raising his arms to silence the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us on this historic evening. Tonight, we witness a leap into the future, a glimpse of the possibilities that electricity brings that we often see on the dark, stormy skies. The man continued, in honor of Mr. Alexander Volta's pioneering work, we will now illuminate this grand building with his invention. He nodded to a technician standing by the switch, who gave a thumbs up in response. In an instant, the switch was flipped and a blinding white light poured out from the top of the stock exchange, illuminating the entire facade. The electric glow bathed the crowd in its brilliance, outshining the oil lamps entirely and casting an almost surreal clarity over everything. The faces of the crowd were suddenly visible. Their expressions were in awe as they took in the scene. Gasps and cheers erupted. As people shielded their eyes from the unexpected brightness, children gaped in wonder, clutching their parents' hands tightly, and Matthew found himself smiling, caught up in the sheer power of the moment. For Matthew, electric lighting had always been a given in the modern world, a technology so omnipresent it was often overlooked. Yet now, seeing the raw reactions of the crowd, he was reminded of how transformative this invention truly was. This light was more than just a marvel. It represented extended productivity, safety, and an undeniable sense of progress that could carry on after sunset. People in the crowd began to chatter excitedly, marveling at the clarity and brilliance of the light. A young boy nearby tugged at his father's coat, his eyes wide as he pointed to the glowing facade of the stock exchange. "Papa, does this mean we won't need candles anymore?" The father chuckled, ruffling his son's hair. "Perhaps someday, my boy, perhaps someday." Matthew's gaze wandered around, catching snippets of conversation. Merchants were already discussing how this technology could change their businesses, allowing longer hours and safer streets. A few well-dressed businessmen exchanged approving nods, murmuring about Volta's contribution and the prospect of future electric advancements. Not only that, their reactions fueled Matthew's desire to create something equally revolutionary. He could already picture their expressions if they were to witness a carriage moving independently, not bound by the need for horses. The sight of an automobile gliding through Amsterdam's crowded streets would surely inspire the same awe, if not more, as the lighting ceremony had tonight. And that's decided. After he finished working with Mr. Hargrave, he would start his own automobile company and make a legacy of himself here in this world.